Hello, I'm Cyrus Youngs. I'm a history student at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. This short lecture is part of the coursework for Professor Chris Jansen's upper-level history class, The Global 60s. In this class, we try to look back upon the tumultuous decade through the lens of a global perspective in an attempt to broaden our viewpoint from the social and economic shifts that we see in the United States, then draw correlations between the macro forces that influence the global community. First, two housekeeping issues. The images provided here are the property of their respective owners. I lay no claim to any of them. I've attempted to use only media which is open source, such as government documents or pictures. I have credited and provided my procurement information for all of them. I also used the term LGBTQ multiple times in this video. The term is simply a linguistic device. Many of the terms in use during the mid-20th century are viewed as derogatory today. This was a conscious decision on my part for simplicity and to avoid confusion or offense. When we think about the 1960s, many important issues spring to the forefront of our minds. Social upheaval, personal discovery, and resistance were all important hallmarks of the decade. Many groups found themselves dispirited and lacking in the freedoms that they viewed other people as having. This presentation is the overview of gay people, which were one of the groups that would come to define their part of the 1960s. To begin discussing the gay situation of the 60s, we must briefly contextualize the era with a look at the 50s. In 1954, Del Martin, Phyllis Lyons, and 6 other multi-ethnic women founded the Daughters of Bilitis in San Francisco. It is credited as the first lesbian social alternative to lesbian bars that were prone to raids by police. Additionally, in February, One Incorporated began publishing One Magazine. One Magazine was a monthly periodical that focused on gay and lesbian issues. The picture on the right was the cover of the earliest One Magazine I could find from 1958. It was one of the exhibits in a later court case that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The first issue was an all-female edition. In 1957, the Wolfden Report was published to the British subjects, making many recommendations on the legal status and treatment of homosexuals and homosexual activity. One of the recommendations clearly present on page 115 is the decriminalization of homosexual behavior between consenting adults, and definitions of consent and in private should be rewritten to reflect the definitions relating to heterosexual activity found elsewhere in British code. In the United States, the Crittenden Report was published by the U.S. Department of Defense. The report concluded that homosexuals did not pose any security risk. The Pentagon ignored the report. Meaningful changes to the United States Civil Service rules, which governed federal employees, were unchanged. The policy of the federal government at the time was to terminate the employment of any person engaging in or suspected of homosexual activity. Additionally, in 1957, Dr. Harry Benjamin coined the phrase transsexual in his paper Transsexualism and Transvestism as psychosomatic and somotopsychic syndromes. He toured the world and worked within the realm of sexual medicine. His work started the study of gender dysphoria, and there is now a charitable organization bearing his name that works to provide access to medical care and community resources for gender dysmorphic people. In Great Britain in 1958, the Homosexual Law Reform Society was founded to advocate for reforms in the Wolfenden Report. It was one of the first gay advocacy organizations. The Homosexual Law Reform Society began to publish pamphlets to notify LGBTQ people what the status of laws dealing with homosexuality were. They wrote letters of advocacy in furtherance of their goals as well. Additionally, in the United States, the Supreme Court heard the case of One Incorporated versus Olson. The case pitted the postmaster of the city of Los Angeles, Otto K. Olson, against One Incorporated, the publisher of the magazine. Postmaster Olson ordered the federal postal authorities to seize the magazine because he considered it to be obscene, lewd, lascivious, and filthy. He also determined that under U.S. Code, the magazine was non-mailable. The publisher sued, arguing that the government's actions violated the First Amendment. The Warren Court agreed and reversed the lower court's ruling, returning the magazine to general circulation. In 1960, the Florida Attorney General Richard Irvin considered the issue of sodomy on Indian reservations. He published a report which concluded that state law did not extend to sexual behaviors. 1961 was, for lack of a better term, a watershed year within the LGBTQ community. A lot happened then. The very first made-for-TV documentary on homosexuality was broadcast on KQED-TV in San Francisco on September 11th. Incidentally, the made-for-TV documentary is now available out of the archives of the Library of Congress and the Bay Area TV archive on YouTube. In Czechoslovakia and Hungary, anti-gay laws were repealed. Fierce debate took place in both instances, but no answer as to the gay question was put forth and voted on. This effectively legalized homosexuality in the two Soviet bloc countries. In November, Jose Sarria was the first openly gay candidate for public office in the United States. He ran for the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, but lost. In 1964, in Canada, the Association for Social Knowledge, ASK, as it was known, was founded. Canada's first gay magazines, Ask, Newsletter, and Gay, began publication. The Dorian Society, another gay advocacy group, was founded in New Zealand. On September 19, 1964, the first street protests for homosexual rights took place in New York City. It was orchestrated by the Homosexual League of New York and the League for Sexual Freedom in front of the Army Induction Center on Whitehall Street. This protest was protesting the Army's dishonorable discharges of lesbian and gay soldiers. Additionally, some advocates reported that draft documents, a breach in confidentiality of draft documents, took place as well. In May of 1965, the Mattachine Society of New York led the first protest in front of the White House dealing with gay issues. There were 7 gay men and 3 gay women who received national TV coverage for their protest. In 1967, in 1968, the Mattachine Society staged a protest known as a sit-in, wherein flamboyant members of the LGBTQ community attempted to buy drinks in the Julius Bar in New York City. This action challenged a long-standing New York State Liquor Authority law prohibiting serving alcohol to gays. The rule ultimately was repealed. The Advocate magazine, a gay publication still in print today, began publishing in Los Angeles. One magazine has been reincarnated, so one is the oldest title in the U.S., and The Advocate is the longest in continuous publication. The American Civil Liberties Union issued a decree that it opposed state sodomy laws and would begin to advocate and litigate cases on behalf of LGBTQ people. The first protest against police by members of the LGBTQ community took place in front of the Black Cat and New Faces bars in Silver Lake, California. The demonstration was in response to a raid of the Black Cat Bar by officers of the Los Angeles Police Department. British Parliament acted upon the recommendations of the Wolfton Committee report and issued legislation a decade after the report. The legislation decriminalized homosexual behavior between consenting adults. In 1968, in East Germany, paragraph 175 of the legal code was eased, which decriminalized the association of homosexual men and women for romantic or formally lewd recreational purposes. In 1969 was considered the watershed moment for the gay liberation movement. On June 28, 1969, plainclothes policemen with the New York Police Department raided a mafia-owned bar called the Stonewall Inn. Several arrests were made for lewd activities and a scuffle ensued. As the sides fought, the melee escalated into the first gay riot. 4 police officers were hurt in the disturbance, and 3 days of protest and unrest followed. Counter-demonstrators cut down a number of trees within a Queens Park that was a rendezvous spot for homosexual men. No arrest for vandalism of the trees was documented. I've included a bibliography.